Jerusalem, July 15, 1099. Blood running ankle-deep through the streets. A Crusader knight named Ludolf of Tournai plants a Christian banner on the city walls, while below him 70,000 Muslim and Jewish civilians lie dead in what will become the most brutal religious massacre in medieval history. But how did we get here? How did a desperate letter from a dying emperor and a single speech by an ambitious pope unleash a holy war that would reshape 3 continents? This is the story of the First Crusade, and it begins not with religious fanatics or holy visions, but with 3 empires playing a deadly game of survival that spiraled completely out of control. Let me take you back to the year 1095. When the medieval world was fracturing along 3 massive fault lines. In the east, the Byzantine Empire, the last remnant of ancient Rome, was hemorrhaging territory to Turkish invaders and facing extinction. In the west, a collection of squabbling European kingdoms spent more time fighting each other than any outside enemy. And stretching from Spain to Central Asia, the Islamic world had never been militarily stronger, but was tearing itself apart in civil wars between rival dynasties. 3 empires, 3 different visions of divine rule, 3 different ideas about who deserved to control the Mediterranean world. None of them realized they were about to collide in the most spectacular and bloody way imaginable. Our story begins with a man who should have been the most powerful ruler in the medieval world, but instead found himself writing the most desperate letter in Byzantine history. Alexios Komnenos, Emperor of Byzantium and heir to 1,000 years of Roman legacy, ruled from Constantinople, the great city we now call Istanbul in Turkey. But by year 1095, Alexios was watching his empire die. 24 years earlier, at a place called Manzikert in what's now eastern Turkey, Alexios's predecessors had suffered the worst military disaster in Byzantine history. A people called the Seljuk Turks, recent converts to Islam and masterful warriors from the Central Asian steppes, had crushed a massive Byzantine army and captured the emperor himself. That single battle had opened the floodgates. Now, as Alexios stood on the battlements of Constantinople looking across the Bosphorus Strait is basically the narrow water between Europe and Asia. He could see Turkish campfires burning where Christian villages had stood for centuries. The Seljuks controlled virtually all of what we now call Turkey, territory that had been Christian and Roman for over 700 years. They were so close to Constantinople that their raiding parties could reach the suburbs of the imperial capital. But Alexios Komnenos was a survivor. He had fought his way to the throne through a decade of civil wars, crushing rivals and outlasting enemies through a combination of military skill and political cunning. He understood something that his predecessors had missed. The Byzantine Empire could no longer fight the Seljuks alone. He needed allies, and there was only one place to find them. In early 1095, Alexios did something that would have been unthinkable to earlier Byzantine emperors. He swallowed his imperial pride and wrote a letter to his bitterest rival, Pope Urban II in Rome, asking for military aid. This was like North Korea asking the United States for help, because the Byzantine and Western churches had been feuding for decades over who was the true head of Christianity. The 2 branches of Christianity had officially split in 1054 in what historians call the Great Schism. Great Schism were basically when Christianity split into Eastern and Western churches. The Byzantines followed Orthodox Christianity, commonly known as Eastern Christianity, under the Patriarch of Constantinople, which sits modern time in Istanbul in Turkey, while Western Europe followed Catholic Christianity under the Pope in Rome. They excommunicated each other. Excommunicated basically means they canceled each other, called each other fake and cheap imitation of the original, and both of them fought over doctrine and viewed each other as heretics. So with information, you got to understand how desperate Alexios, the Byzantine emperor, was. He was desperate enough to try anything. His letter to Pope Urban was a masterpiece of diplomatic manipulation. Alexios portrayed himself not as a rival emperor seeking political assistance, but as a fellow Christian begging for help against the enemies of the faith. He described Turkish armies desecrating Christian churches, forcing Christian women into slavery, and blocking pilgrim routes to the Holy Land. Some of these stories were true, others were exaggerated, but all were calculated to inflame Western Christian opinion. Most importantly, Alexios the Emperor offered Urban, aka the Pope, something irresistible: the possibility of reuniting Eastern and Western Christianity under papal authority. Basically, this would greatly increase the power and influence of the Catholic Church. If Urban, our Pope, sent soldiers to help defend Byzantium, Alexios the Emperor hinted he might be willing to acknowledge Rome's supremacy over Constantinople. It was a lie, but it was exactly what Urban the Pope wanted to hear. But Alexios made a crucial miscalculation. He asked for a few thousand professional soldiers, mercenaries who could be hired, used, and dismissed when the job was done. He had no idea he was about to unleash the largest military expedition in medieval history. While Alexios was plotting his survival in Constantinople, the Islamic world was experiencing its own crisis, though few realized it at the time. On paper, the Islamic world in the year 1095 looked unstoppable. Muslim armies controlled everything from southern Spain to the borders of India. Islamic science, medicine, and philosophy were centuries ahead of anything in Christian Europe. But beneath this impressive facade, the Muslim world was fracturing along political and sectarian lines. The crisis had begun 3 years earlier, in year 1092, with the death of Malik Shah, the Seljuk Sultan, who had built the largest Islamic empire since the early caliphs, aka the Muslim emperors. Malik Shah had ruled everything from Turkey to Iran, but when he died suddenly at age 37, possibly from poison, his empire immediately began tearing itself apart. The problem was succession. Islamic political theory had never solved the fundamental question of how to transfer power peacefully from one ruler to the next. I know it may not seem like a big deal of choosing the next successor, but the great empires like Alexander AS were wiped out because he didn't choose a successor and basically gave birth to the Roman Empire. So when a strong sultan died, his sons, brothers, and generals typically fought a civil war to determine who would rule next. Malik Shah's death triggered exactly this kind of succession crisis, but on a vast, massive scale. In Anatolia, what's now modern Turkey, Malik Shah's son, Kilij Arslan, inherited a fragment of the Seljuk Empire. Kilij Arslan, whose name means lion sword, was young, ambitious, and convinced of his own invincibility. He had grown up hearing stories of how his father's armies had humiliated the Byzantines at Manzikert, the same war and worst military disaster in Byzantine history, where their emperor got captured, as I mentioned beginning. So do you understand why Emperor Alexios later begged the Pope, aka his rival, for help? And Kilij Arslan, our Turkish Sultan, assumed that any new Christian army would be just as easy to defeat. This part is crucial to understand, because not only did Kilij inherit basically an inferior army, but now in future he is going to face a very different army his father fought, so it's going to be double whammy for our Turk Sultan Kilij. But at the current moment, he is basically at the border of Constantinople, nearly assured of his victory. And not only that, but in the further south, in Syria, power was divided between competing Seljuk princes who spent more time fighting each other than defending against external threats. Basically, Muslim rulers in fighting. In Damascus, one branch of the Seljuk family controlled southern Syria. In Aleppo, their cousins controlled the north. In Mosul, in what's now Iraq, yet another Seljuk prince named Kerboga was building his own power base and dreaming of conquering Baghdad itself. Even more problematically, these Sunni Muslim Seljuks were engaged in a bitter religious war with the Fatimid dynasty of Egypt, aka the Egyptian Muslim rulers who followed the Shiite branch of Islam. The Fatimids had recently reconquered Jerusalem from the Seljuks and were threatening to expand into Syria. From the perspective of both Sunni and Shiite Muslims, the other branch of Islam was almost as dangerous as Christianity. So this time frame you can see that the entire Muslim empire is completely fractured while the Christian going to come under the same banner. It's not that Muslim forces were weak, it's that they were heavily divided and were deeply hostile to one another. This political fragmentation was the Islamic world's fatal weakness, though none of the players recognized it at the time. When the Crusaders finally arrived, they would face not a unified Islamic response, but a collection of competing Muslim dynasties who often seemed more interested in fighting each other than repelling the Christian invasion. The tragic irony was that the Islamic world had never been militarily stronger or more sophisticated, which is just hilarious in retrospect. Turkish horse archers were the finest light cavalry in the world. They were basically F-22 fighter jet of that time. The Islamic siege engines and fortification techniques were centuries ahead of European technology. Muslim armies vastly outnumbered anything the Christians could field, but all of this military superiority meant nothing when it was divided against itself. On the other side of 800 miles west of Constantinople, in the Lateran Palace in Rome, Pope Urban II was dealing with his own survival crisis when Alexios's letter arrived. You see, Pope Urban, whose birth name was Odo of Ligury, was a French nobleman who had become pope in the year of 1088, but being pope in the late 11th century was far from the prestigious position it would later become. Urban was locked in a vicious struggle with Holy Roman Emperor Henry IV over who really controlled the Catholic Church. This conflict, called the investiture controversy, had been raging for decades. The fundamental question was whether the Pope in Rome or the Emperor in Germany had the right to appoint bishops and control church property. It might sound like a technical dispute, but it determined who held real power in medieval Europe. So very similar to Islamic power tussle in some regard, but it's about to wildly change. Henry IV was no ordinary opponent. He was the most powerful ruler in Europe, controlling Germany, northern Italy, and much of Central Europe. He had his own candidate for pope, a man named Clement III, who controlled Rome itself while Pope Urban was forced to operate from the margins of the city. Pope Urban's authority was questionable, his resources were limited, and his political future was uncertain. Basically, he was only pope in name and doesn't hold that much power. But Pope Urban was a brilliant political strategist who understood something about European psychology that his predecessors had missed. The problem with medieval Europe wasn't that Christians lacked fighting spirit. The problem was that they spent all their time fighting each other instead of external enemies. French nobles fought English nobles, German princes fought Italian cities, and everyone fought everyone in an endless cycle of feudal violence. It's like Clash of Clans, but in real life. What if Urban could redirect all that military energy outward instead of inward? What if he could unite the quarreling kingdoms of Europe behind a common cause that would simultaneously strengthen papal authority, the Pope's power, and weaken his imperial rivals and solve the problem of excessive nightly violence in one single swoop? When Alexios's letter arrived in early year 1095 asking for military aid against the Muslims, Urban saw an opportunity that was too perfect to ignore. Here was a chance to prove that the Pope, not the German Emperor, was the real leader of Western Christendom. Here was a way to channel feudal warfare into something that would benefit the Church rather than destroy it. And here was a possibility of reuniting Eastern and Western Christianity under papal authority. Urban spent months planning his response, but first he decided to test the waters. In March 1095, he called a church council in the northern Italian city of Piacenza. Officially, the Council of Piacenza was supposed to discuss church reform and clerical discipline. But Urban had arranged for Byzantine envoys to attend, and he gave them a prominent platform to describe Turkish atrocities against Eastern Christians. The response was everything Urban had hoped for. The assembled bishops and nobles were outraged by stories of Christian pilgrims being tortured and killed, Christian churches being turned into mosques, and Christian women being sold in Muslim slave markets. Many offered to take up arms immediately to defend their fellow Christians, but Pope Urban was too skilled a politician to act impulsively. He needed a bigger stage and a more dramatic setting for what he was planning. He needed an event that would capture the imagination of all Europe and establish him as the undisputed leader of Western Christianity. On November 27, 1095, Pope Urban II climbed onto a wooden platform outside the Cathedral of Clermont in central France and delivered what may be the most influential speech in medieval history. We don't know exactly what Urban said because nobody wrote it down at the time, but we know the effect was electric because 5 different chroniclers tried to reconstruct the speech from memory years later, and their versions all capture the same themes and the same passionate intensity. Urban began by reminding his audience of their Christian duty to protect their fellow believers. He painted graphic pictures of Turkish armies attacking Christian pilgrims on their way to Jerusalem, forcing Christian women into harems and turning the Church of the Holy Sepulchre into a stable for horses. He described Muslim soldiers urinating on Christian altars and using sacred vessels as drinking cups. Many of these stories were exaggerated or completely fabricated, but Urban knew his audience. Medieval Christians lived in a world where the supernatural was part of daily life, where every military victory or defeat was seen as a direct intervention by God, and where the line between earthly warfare and cosmic battle between good and evil was razor thin. Then Urban made his masterstroke. He offered something that was irresistible to medieval minds: complete forgiveness of sins for anyone who took up arms to liberate Jerusalem from Muslim control. In an age when people believed that most souls would spend centuries burning in purgatory to pay for their earthly sins, this was like offering a free ticket to heaven. The crowd went wild. People began shouting, "Deus vult," which means "God wills it" in Latin. They tore their clothes to make crosses and sewed them onto their shoulders as a sign that they had taken the cross and pledged to join the holy war. Urban had planned to set August 15th, year 1096, as the official departure date, giving organizers nearly a year to prepare, but he had unleashed something far beyond his control. Almost immediately, the call to crusade spread across Europe like wildfire. But Urban quickly realized that he had created a monster he couldn't control, because the first person to respond to his call was not a powerful nobleman or professional soldier, but a charismatic street preacher who would turn Pope Urban's carefully planned military expedition into a religious movement that would spiral into disaster. Peter the Hermit was everything Pope Urban was not. Where Urban was a sophisticated aristocrat who understood politics and diplomacy, Peter was a wild-eyed mystic who claimed to receive visions directly from Jesus Christ. Where Pope Urban wanted to organize a disciplined military campaign led by professional knights, Peter preached a populist crusade of the poor and humble that would succeed through faith rather than military skill. Peter, also called Little Peter because of his short stature, was a French priest who had apparently attempted a pilgrimage to Jerusalem before year 1095, only to be turned back by Turkish authorities who had mistreated him. Whether this story was true or not, Peter the Hermit told it with such passionate conviction that crowds were moved to tears. By spring 1096, Peter was traveling through northern France and Germany with a growing army of followers. But these weren't knights or professional soldiers. These were peasants, serfs, urban poor, and social outcasts who saw the crusade as their chance to escape crushing poverty, earn salvation, and perhaps find wealth and adventure in the East. The appeal was irresistible to people who had nothing to lose. Europe in the 1090s was experiencing a series of famines, plagues, and economic disruptions that had made life miserable for the common people. Peter promised that God would provide for his followers on their journey, that Christian communities along the route would supply them with food and shelter, and that the journey itself would wash away their sins. By April year 1096, Peter had assembled an army of about 40,000 people in Cologne, in what's now Western Germany. The army included some knights and professional soldiers, but the vast majority were ordinary people with no military training, inadequate weapons, and no understanding of what they were about to face. Peter wasn't the only popular preacher to respond to Pope Urban's call. A minor nobleman named Emico of Flonheim began organizing his own version of the People's Crusade, but Emico had a different idea about who the enemies of Christianity really were. Before marching east to fight Muslims in Jerusalem, Amico argued, Christians should deal with the enemies of Christ closer to home. What followed was some of the worst anti-Jewish violence in European history up to that point. Amico's followers attacked Jewish communities throughout the Rhineland, claiming that it made no sense to travel thousands of miles to fight Muslims when Jews, who they blamed for the crucifixion of Christ, lived right next door. The massacres were horrific. In the city of Speyer, 12 Jews were murdered before the local bishop intervened to protect the survivors. In Worms, around 800 Jews were killed. In Mainz, over 1,000 Jews died, including many who killed their own children rather than watch them be slaughtered by the Crusaders. These Rhineland massacres established a precedent that would haunt Christian-Jewish relations for centuries. The idea that holy war against Muslims justified violence against Jews would reappear in every subsequent crusade, creating a legacy of anti-Semitic violence that would culminate in the Holocaust 8 centuries later. Meanwhile, Peter's main army began its march across Europe toward Constantinople, but they were completely unprepared for the logistical challenges of moving 40,000 people across a continent. They had no organized supply system, no clear chain of command, and no plan beyond march east and let God provide. As Peter's army moved through Hungary and the Balkans, conflicts erupted with local populations who were understandably nervous about feeding and housing such a massive group of armed pilgrims. In one Hungarian town, a dispute over the price of a pair of shoes escalated into a riot that left 4,000 Hungarians dead and earned Peter's army a reputation for violence and chaos. By August year 1096, Peter's bedraggled army of about 30,000 survivors reached Constantinople. Emperor Alexios took one look at this mob of peasants and realized with horror that this was definitely not what he had asked for. He had requested a few thousand professional soldiers who could be hired and controlled. Instead, he got tens of thousands of poor pilgrims who he now had to feed and manage. Emperor Alexios quickly arranged to ship Peter's army across the Bosphorus Strait, aka the water between Asia and Europe, into Asia Minor, with strict orders to wait for the main Crusade armies before attempting any military operations. Did you hear that? Wait till the real army, the solider, who know how to fight or at least have a somewhat simple idea what they even doing in battlefield. But Peter's followers were too eager for glory and too convinced of their divine protection to listen to Byzantine military advice. Again, in the head of Peter's army, they def boost by God himself. They got plot armor at least in their mind. So, almost immediately after crossing into Turkish territory, the Crusaders split into competing ethnic groups and began raiding local settlements. Some German contingents captured a fortress called Zaragordan, but were quickly surrounded by Turkish forces who cut off their water supply. After 8 days of thirst, the Germans were forced to surrender and were either killed or sold into slavery. When news of this disaster reached the main camp at a place called Civito, Peter was away in Constantinople trying to secure more supplies from Emperor Alexios. In Peter's absence, a French knight named Walter Sans-Avoir, whose nickname meant Walter the Penniless, led about 20,000 crusaders toward the Turkish capital city of Nicaea, hoping to win glory and loot by capturing it themselves. They walked straight into a trap. On October 21st, 1096, Sultan Kili Arslan, you know, the same dude who was nightmare for Emperor Alexios, he was waiting with a professional Turkish army at a narrow valley near the village of Draken. The young sultan had assumed that these new crusaders would be just as easy to defeat as any previous Byzantine army. And guess what? He was right. Absolutely right. The Battle of Civito was a massacre. Turkish horse archers surrounded the crusaders and shot them down like animals. The crusaders had no effective response to Turkish mobility and archery. They panicked, broke formation, and were slaughtered as they tried to flee. Upwards of 20,000 people died in a matter of hours, including Walter the Penniless and most of Peter's original followers. Only about 3,000 crusaders managed to escape back to Byzantine territory, where they were rescued by a Byzantine naval squadron. Peter the Hermit returned from Constantinople to find his holy army destroyed, and his dreams of leading the poor to Jerusalem turned into a nightmare. But the disaster of the People's Crusade taught both sides important lessons. The Turks learned that European armies could be defeated using traditional tactics, which made them overconfident about facing future Christian invasions. The Byzantines learned that the Westerners were far more numerous and far less controllable than they had expected, which made them increasingly nervous about what was coming next. Because while Peter's peasants were being slaughtered in Turkey, the real Crusade armies were finally getting organized, and they had very different ideas about what this expedition was supposed to accomplish. Till now, all the Crusader had one thing in my mind: looting Middle East and getting ticket to free heaven. The main Crusade armies that began assembling in late 1096 represented the cream of European military aristocracy, but they were united by little more than a shared desire to reach Jerusalem. Each leader had his own motivations, his own agenda, and his own ideas about what the Crusade should achieve. But now we see a lot of different kind of motivation for crusading. First, we got our most idealistic of the Crusade leaders was Godfrey of Bouillon, Duke of Lower Lorraine in what's now Belgium. Godfrey seemed to be everything a crusader was supposed to be: deeply religious, militarily competent, and wealthy enough to fund his own expedition. He had mortgaged his entire duchy to raise money for the crusade. Bro sold his estate and melted down. All the gold he got to fund crusades, which suggested a level of religious commitment that impressed even contemporary observers. But Godfrey's financial situation also raised questions about his true motivations. Medieval nobles who sold their patrimony were usually either desperate for cash or convinced they would not be coming home. Godfrey's decision to liquidate his entire inheritance suggested that he saw the crusade as either a financial necessity or a one-way journey to martyrdom. Bro was all in. Either he getting Jerusalem or die trying. I think Godfrey is probably what people comes to mind when they think of all the crusader in full, shiny knight armor. Second, from southern France came Raymond of Toulouse, the richest and most powerful noble in Europe. Raymond was 55 years old, ancient by medieval standards, but he brought the largest army and the most money to the crusade. Unlike some of the other leaders, Raymond seemed genuinely motivated by religious devotion rather than political ambition. He had been fighting Muslims in Spain for years and saw the crusade as the culmination of a lifetime spent in holy war. Bro basically had enough. My interpretation is he wanted revenge more than Jerusalem. Again, I don't know what he actually wanted though. But Raymond's wealth and power also made him a natural rival to the other crusade leaders. He expected to be recognized as the expedition's overall commander, and he was not pleased when other nobles refused to acknowledge his authority. Classic ego clash. Third, from Norman Sicily came the most dangerous and ambitious crusader of all, Bohemond of Taranto. Bohemond was the son of Robert Guiscard, the Norman warlord who had conquered southern Italy and spent decades fighting Byzantine armies. Bohemond himself had been campaigning against Emperor Alexios for years before taking the cross, which made his participation in a crusade supposedly designed to help Byzantium deeply suspicious. Bro was giving vibes of sleeper agent, but crusade was one of the most crazy time in history after all. Bohemond was everything Raymond wasn't: young, physically imposing, and absolutely ruthless in pursuit of his goals. Contemporary chroniclers described him as exceptionally tall and handsome, with piercing blue eyes and a commanding presence that made him stand out in any crowd. But they also noted his reputation for cunning and his complete lack of scruples when it came to achieving his objectives. He was really ambitious in a single word. Nothing mattered for him other than him and his goals. And that's it. Unlike the other crusade leaders, Bohemond had relatively little land or wealth in Europe. He was a younger son who had inherited only a small principality in southern Italy, and he saw the crusade as his chance to carve out a much larger domain in the east. From the beginning, Bohemont's goal was not religious pilgrimage, but political conquest. The expedition also included Robert Curthose, Duke of Normandy and brother of the English king. Robert had pawned his duchy to his brother to raise money for the Crusade, which suggested either remarkable piety or remarkable financial desperation. Robert of Flanders brought a substantial army from what's now Belgium and northern France. Hugh of Vermandois, brother of the French king, provided royal legitimacy to the enterprise. Perhaps most importantly, Stephen of Blois joined the Crusade as one of its wealthiest and most respected leaders. Stephen was married to Adela, daughter of William the Conqueror, which gave him connections to the highest levels of European nobility. His participation helped convince other nobles that the Crusade was a legitimate and prestigious enterprise. So you get the idea basically how First Crusades actually stopped the infighting and collective concentrated their fighting focus at Islamic military power. When these armies began converging on Constantinople in late 1096 and early 1097, Emperor Alexios faced his second major shock. He had asked for a few thousand mercenaries. Instead, he was confronted with nearly 60,000 professional soldiers, plus at least that many non-combatants, all led by powerful nobles who had their own political agendas. Bro was like getting doughs attacked by tens of thousands of mercenaries for months. Now, since our Emperor Alexios can see that this army is not peasants, but real hardcore force, he tried to control the situation by requiring each crusade leader to swear an oath of allegiance to the Byzantine Empire and promise to return any former Byzantine territories they captured. After a lot of arguments, most of the leaders eventually agreed, though some held out longer than others. Bohemond, our ambitious young guy, was particularly reluctant to swear the oath, and everyone eventually understood that his promise was essentially worthless. The logistics of managing such a massive army were staggering. Constantinople in year 1097 had a population of perhaps 400,000 people. Suddenly, the city had to feed, house, and supply an additional 100,000 Western Europeans who spoke different languages, followed different customs, and had very different ideas about military discipline. Cultural conflicts erupted almost immediately. The Byzantines were sophisticated urban dwellers who followed complex court protocols and orthodox religious practices. The Crusaders were mostly rural warriors who valued personal honor above diplomatic niceties and viewed Byzantine Christianity as suspiciously foreign. More seriously, the two groups had fundamentally different ideas about what the Crusade was supposed to achieve. Emperor Alexios wanted to use the Crusaders as auxiliary troops to help him reconquer Turkish-held territories for the Byzantine Empire. The Crusaders wanted to establish their own independent kingdoms in any lands they captured. These conflicting goals would create tensions that would poison Christian relations throughout the expedition. By spring 1097, this massive and unruly army was finally ready to begin the real campaign. Their first target was Nicaea, the Seljuk capital in western Turkey, and the same city that Peter's peasants had been marching toward when they were destroyed. But this time, the Christian army was led by professional soldiers who understood siege warfare, and they had the support of Byzantine engineers and naval forces. The siege of Nicaea became the Crusaders' first real test of their ability to work together and their effectiveness against Turkish military tactics. It would also become the first major source of conflict between the Crusaders and their Byzantine allies, setting a pattern of mistrust and betrayal that would define the rest of the expedition. When the main Crusader army reached the walls of Nicaea in May 1097, they faced one of the strongest fortresses in the Muslim world. The city's massive walls stretched for over 3 miles and were protected by more than 100 towers. Nicaea controlled the main route from Constantinople to the interior of Turkey, making it the key to any campaign in Asia Minor. But the Crusaders had several advantages that Peter's peasant army had lacked. They brought professional siege engineers who knew how to build catapults, battering rams, and siege towers. They had the support of a Byzantine fleet that could blockade the city from the lake that protected its southern approaches. Most importantly, they faced a much smaller Turkish garrison than they had expected. Sultan Kili Arslan had made a crucial strategic error. Overconfident after his easy victory over the People's Crusade, Bro was tired killing noobs, so he had taken most of his army east to fight other Turkish rivals for control of central Anatolia, aka modern-day Turkey. He left Nicaea, his capital city, defended by only a small garrison under his wife and family, assuming that any new Christian army would be just as easy to defeat as Peter's mob. So the current siege lasted 6 weeks and demonstrated both the Crusaders' military capabilities and the fault lines that would eventually tear their coalition apart. The Western Europeans proved that they could conduct sophisticated siege operations and coordinate attacks between multiple armies. Bohemond's Normans attacked from the north, Godfrey's Lorrainers assaulted the eastern walls, and Raymond's Provençals concentrated on the southern approaches. But the siege also revealed the growing tension between the Crusaders and Emperor Alexios. The Byzantines had been secretly negotiating with the Turkish garrison throughout the siege, offering them safe passage in exchange for surrendering the city intact rather than fighting to the end. You know their diplomatic way. Now I think all Byzantine's doing is just negotiating. Basically, this was standard Byzantine diplomatic practice, designed to minimize casualties and preserve valuable infrastructure. On June 19, 1097, the Crusaders woke up and got the shock of their lifetime. You know what they find. They find Byzantine banners flying over Nicaea's walls. Yep, 100,000 previous casualty and 6-day siege, and now they seeing the Byzantine flag out of nowhere, so you know, pretty crazy sight to see. The city had surrendered during the night, but not to them. The Turkish garrison had been allowed to escape with their weapons and personal property, and the city's treasury had been secured by Byzantine officials rather than distributed to the Crusaders as war booty. Yikes. So you know, obviously the Western leaders were furious. They had spent 6 weeks conducting a dangerous and expensive siege operation, and they had been cheated out of their reward by none other but by their supposed allies. Bohemond, you know the ambitious guy in particular, was outraged, seeing this as proof that the Byzantines could not be trusted and had no intention of allowing the Crusaders to benefit from their conquests. But before the Crusaders could decide how to respond to this betrayal, Sultan Kilij Arslan returned with his army to reclaim his capita, Nicaea. On July 1, 1097, at a place called Dorylaeum, about 50 miles southeast of Nicaea, the Turks finally got their chance to face the main Crusader army in open battle. The Battle of Dorylaeum was the most important military engagement of the entire First Crusade, because it established the tactical principles that would govern Christian-Muslim warfare for the next 2 centuries. It was also Bohemond of Taranto's masterpiece, the battle that proved his reputation as the Crusaders' most skilled military commander. Kilij Arslan's strategy was classic Turkish mobile warfare. His army consisted primarily of light cavalry and horse archers who could move faster than any European force and attack from a safe distance. The plan was to surround the Crusaders, pepper them with arrows until their formations broke down, and then close in for the kill, which was greatly, and I mean greatly, successful in past. They just full-on spammed this move on their enemy. And you know what? This tactic had worked brilliantly against Byzantine armies for decades. European heavy cavalry was devastating in a direct charge, but only if they could reach their enemies. Turkish horse archers could stay out of range of European lances and swords while inflicting steady casualties with their composite bows. But Bohemond understood something about Turkish tactics that previous Christian commanders had missed. The effectiveness of horse archery depended on maintaining mobility and avoiding close combat. If the Turkish cavalry could be forced to stand and fight, European heavy cavalry would have a decisive advantage. Bro was onto something. At Dorylaeum, Bohemond implemented a defensive strategy that would become the standard Christian response to Turkish tactics. Instead of trying to chase the Turkish cavalry across the battlefield, he formed his army into a tight defensive formation and waited for the enemy to come to him. For hours, Turkish arrows rained down on the Crusader army while Bohemond held his troops in position. The temptation to charge must have been enormous, especially as men and horses fell to Turkish archery. But Bohemond understood that patience was more important than courage. The breakthrough came when Raymond, the richest 55-year-old guy of Toulouse, arrived with reinforcements that Kilij Arslan had not expected. Suddenly, the Turks found themselves caught between two Christian armies and unable to maintain their mobility. Their most effective strategy has finally come to a halt. When Bohemond finally ordered the charge, his heavy cavalry smashed into the Turkish ranks with devastating effect. Kilij Arslan's army shattered and fled, leaving the road to Syria wide open. But the real significance of Dorylaeum was not tactical, but psychological. For the first time, a major Turkish army had been decisively defeated by European forces. The myth of Turkish invincibility had been broken, and both sides learned lessons that would shape the rest of the campaign. The balance of power shift was enormous, and you have to understand, when you defeat an undefeatable army, you will get a sense of divine intervention, and it will give the Crusader for the morale they're going to need in future, because things are just going to escalate crazy now. But for now, in the current time, the Crusaders learned that they could defeat Turkish armies in direct combat, but only if they maintained discipline and avoided the temptation to pursue fleeing enemies. The Turks learned that these were not the same Europeans they had been defeating for decades. These Crusaders were something new and very dangerous, and they would require a fundamentally different approach. After their victory at Dorylaeum, the Crusader army began the most grueling phase of their entire campaign, the march across central Turkey towards Syria. This journey, which took nearly 3 months, was almost as deadly as any battle they would fight. Kilij Arslan had learned from his defeat and adopted a new strategy designed to destroy the Crusaders without risking another direct confrontation. He implemented a scorched earth policy, systematically destroying every source of food and water in the Crusaders' path. Wells were poisoned, crops were burned, and livestock was driven away or slaughtered. The summer heat in central Anatolia was merciless, often exceeding 100 degrees Fahrenheit. The Crusaders had to march in full armor across a landscape that had been deliberately turned into a desert. Water became more precious than gold, and men fought over muddy puddles that contained more dirt than moisture. Turkish raiders harassed the army constantly, appearing without warning to attack stragglers and supply trains before disappearing back into the empty landscape. The Crusaders could never catch these raiders, but they could never ignore them either. Every day brought a steady drumbeat of casualties from heat, thirst, disease, and enemy action. The toll on both men and animals was staggering. Thousands of Crusaders died during the march, including many knights who had survived the battles at Nicaea and Dorylaeum. Horses died in such numbers that many nobles were reduced to walking, and some were forced to ride oxen or donkeys instead of war horses. But perhaps the most significant casualty of the march was the Crusaders' moral cohesion. The expedition had begun with high ideals about Christian brotherhood and holy war, but the reality of medieval logistics gradually stripped away these romantic notions. Food became so scarce that the army began fragmenting along ethnic and class lines. The Norman knights hoarded supplies while Provençal infantry starved. French nobles commandeered carts while German foot soldiers collapsed from exhaustion. The Crusade was supposed to unite Western Christianity against the Muslim enemy, but it was actually revealing the deep divisions within European society. The army also began leaving a trail of atrocities behind them. When they captured Turkish settlements, they showed no mercy to civilians. When they encountered Eastern Christians who followed different religious practices, they often treated them as enemies rather than fellow believers. The line between holy war and simple brutality was becoming increasingly blurred. By the time the Crusader army finally reached the borders of Syria, in October 1097, they had lost perhaps a third of their original strength to battle, disease, and desertion. But the survivors had been forged into something harder and more dangerous than the army that had left Constantinople. They had learned to endure unimaginable hardships, to fight as a coordinated force and to view their enemies not as fellow human beings, but as obstacles to be eliminated. At this point, with crazy ton of propaganda and harsher conditions, the Crusader doesn't even seeing the people other than humans, and they themselves become something other themselves, far from what you call a human. They had also developed a siege mentality that would shape their behavior for the rest of the campaign. After 3 months of suffering in the Turkish desert, many Crusaders had concluded that they were surrounded by enemies who would show them no mercy. This would have fatal consequences for the civilian populations of Syria and Palestine. While the main Crusader army was struggling across central Turkey, one of the expedition's most ambitious leaders was pursuing his own agenda in a different direction. Baldwin of Boulogne, younger brother of Godfrey of Bouillon, had broken away from the main army with a small force of knights and was marching southeast toward the Armenian city of Edessa. Baldwin's expedition was supposedly a response to a request for help from the Armenian Christians of Edessa, who were under pressure from neighboring Turkish forces. But Baldwin's real motivation was the same ambition that drove Bohemond, the desire to carve out his own independent principality in the east. The Armenian population of Edessa welcomed Baldwin as a liberator, and their elderly ruler Thoros adopted him as his son and heir. But Baldwin was not content to wait for a peaceful succession. In March 1098, Thoros was killed in what was officially described as a popular uprising, but was almost certainly a coup orchestrated by Baldwin and his supporters. Baldwin's seizure of Edessa was significant for several reasons. It established the first Crusader state, proving that the expedition could achieve lasting political conquest rather than just military victory. It also demonstrated that some Crusade leaders were more interested in personal enrichment than religious pilgrimage. But Baldwin's actions also created a dangerous precedent for relations between the Crusaders and the Eastern Christian populations they claimed to be liberating. The Armenians of Edessa had welcomed Baldwin as a protector, only to see their legitimate ruler murdered and replaced by a Western usurper. This pattern would be repeated throughout the Crusades. Eastern Christians would initially support the Crusaders against Muslim rule, only to discover that Western domination was often just as oppressive as Turkish control. And the only lesson we can learn from here is, remember kids, oppression doesn't see your color, religion, or language. Everything gets equal treatment. Oppression is woke F. When the main Crusader army finally reached Syria, they faced their greatest challenge yet, the ancient city of Antioch. Located in what's now southern Turkey near the Syrian border, Antioch was one of the most important cities in the Middle East and one of the strongest fortresses in the Muslim world. The city was defended by Yagi Siyan, a veteran Turkish commander who had been governor of Antioch since 1088. Yagi Siyan was everything Kilij Arslan was not: experienced, cautious, and thoroughly prepared for a long siege. He had spent months stockpiling food and weapons, strengthening the city's fortifications, and expelling most of the Christian population to eliminate potential traitors. When the Crusaders arrived at Antioch's walls on October 20th, 1097, they faced fortifications that made Nicaea look simple by comparison. The city's walls stretched for 12 miles and were protected by over 400 towers. Antioch was built on the slopes of Mount Silpius, making assault from most directions nearly impossible. It was boss battle time. And not even that, but worse, the Crusaders quickly realized they didn't have nearly enough men to completely surround such a huge city. Turkish defenders could move freely in and out of the city, bringing in supplies and launching surprise attacks on the Crusader camps. Their conditions are not like if Crusaders besieged the Antioch, but the governor Yagi Siyan besieged the Crusaders. Basically, they have zero advantage as an attacking army. Now, normally, when you're besieging a city, you should have all the advantages. You control the countryside, you cut off their supplies, you choose when to attack, and you have a safe base to fall back to. But at Antioch, it was completely backwards. The Turkish defenders were moving freely in and out of the city, bringing in fresh supplies while the Crusaders were slowly starving outside. Yagi Sion's men were launching surprise raids on the Crusader camps whenever they felt like it, while the Crusaders were stuck in these vulnerable positions outside the walls with nowhere to retreat. So even though the Crusaders were technically the ones doing the besieging, they were actually trapped in a worse situation than the people they were supposed to be attacking. Basically, if you are ever besieging and you are stuck in this situation, then everything can go wrong. What followed was 7.5 months of the most miserable siege warfare in medieval history. The Crusaders established camps outside the city's northern walls, but they couldn't prevent Turkish raids or stop supplies from reaching the defenders. Okay, and now you may think that's the worst Crusader may have to face, right? Nope. Winter set in, and the Crusader army began to experience the worst conditions of the entire campaign. Food became so scarce that knights were eating their horses, and common soldiers were reduced to boiling leather belts and shoes to make soup. Of the thousands of horses the army had brought from Europe, only 700 survived the winter. Disease spread through the camps like wildfire. Typhus, dysentery, and malaria killed thousands of Crusaders. The death toll from disease was probably higher than all the battle casualties combined. Now the situation is so hopeless that desertion became an epidemic. Even prominent leaders began to slip away in the night. Peter the Hermit, you know the dude who was so eager to do Crusade that he didn't even waited for real army to show up, who had joined the main army after the destruction of his peasant crusade, tried to desert but was caught by Tancred of Hauteville, Bohemond's nephew, and brought back in shame. I mean, even before the physical battle, they were already losing the psychological ones. More seriously, Tatius, the Byzantine representative who had been traveling with the Crusaders as Emperor Alexios's liaison, abandoned the army and returned to Constantinople. Tatius claimed he was going to secure reinforcements, but most Crusaders interpreted his departure as proof that the Byzantines had betrayed them. The situation became even more desperate when spies brought word that a massive Muslim relief army was assembling in Mosul under the command of Kerboga, one of the most powerful Turkish leaders in the region. Kerboga's army was rumored to include 75,000 men, nearly 5 times larger than the surviving Crusader force. But just when things looked hopeless, the Crusaders' luck began to change. Ships from Genoa and England arrived at the port of Saint-Simeon with crucial supplies, including timber for siege engines and skilled engineers who knew how to build them. More importantly, Bohemond finally played the card he had been holding in secret throughout the winter. Sometime during the siege, he had made contact with an Armenian Christian named Firuz, who commanded one of the towers in Antioch's walls. Firuz's motivation for betraying the city was never entirely clear. Some sources suggest he had been passed over for promotion by Yagi Sion. Others claim his wife had been seduced by another officer. What is certain is that Firuz was willing to open his tower to the Crusaders in exchange for money and a position in the new regime. But Bohemond kept this contact secret while he maneuvered to ensure that he, rather than the collective leadership, would benefit from Antioch's capture. He approached the other Crusade leaders with a proposal. If he could deliver the city to them, they should agree to let him keep it as his own principality. Raymond of Toulouse was furious. He argued that they had all sworn oaths to Emperor Alexios to return captured Byzantine territory, and Antioch had been Byzantine before the Turks conquered it. But with Kerboga's army approaching, and the siege dragging on indefinitely, the other leaders reluctantly agreed to Bohemond's demand. Stephen of Blois, one of the most respected Crusade leaders, chose this moment to abandon the expedition entirely. Convinced that the crusade was doomed, Stephen slipped away with his followers and began the long journey back to Europe. His desertion would have consequences far beyond his personal reputation, because Stephen would spread word throughout Europe that the crusade had failed and the army had been destroyed. On the night of June 1098, Bohemond put his plan into action. He marched a large part of the Crusader army away from Antioch, making it look like they had given up the siege. But at midnight, he doubled back with 60 picked knights to the section of wall controlled by Firuz. At 3 in the morning on June 3rd, Firuz lowered a rope ladder from the Tower of the Two Sisters. The knights climbed up one by one, terrified they were walking into a trap. Once inside, they crept through the darkened city, killing guards and opening the gates for the main army. By dawn, thousands of crusaders were pouring into Antioch. The Turkish garrison was caught completely off guard. Governor Yagi Sian fled the city but was captured by local Christians and beheaded. His severed head was brought to Bohemond as proof of victory. The usual massacre followed. Crusaders rampaged through the city, killing every Muslim they could find and looting everything of value. Even Firuz, the Armenian who had made their victory possible, was killed in the chaos when Crusaders couldn't distinguish him from other local residents. By evening on June 3rd, the Crusaders controlled all of Antioch except for the citadel on Mount Silpius, which held out under Yagi Sian's son, Shams ad-Dawla. But their celebration was cut short, because the next morning, Kerboga's massive relief army appeared on the horizon. The arrival of Kerboga's army created one of the most dramatic reversals in military history. In a single day, the Crusaders went from besiegers to besieged. These people can't catch a break, man. So from victors to potential victims. They had conquered Antioch, but now they were trapped inside it. Well, to be honest, when they were outside, the situation was not so good either. But at least they are not going to stuck between two armies from both sides. And that's the only hopeful side they found themselves in. Because Kerboga had assembled one of the largest Muslim armies of the medieval period, drawing troops from across northern Iraq and Syria. His force included not only Turkish cavalry, but also Arab infantry, Kurdish archers, and siege specialists from Baghdad. Contemporary sources estimate his army at 75,000 men, though this number may be exaggerated. More problematically for the Crusaders, Kerboga's coalition included several Turkish princes who had been enemies of each other until the Christian invasion forced them to cooperate. The arrival of the Crusaders in Syria had begun to create the very unity in the Muslim world that had been lacking since Malik Shah's death. What an irony. For 3 weeks, the Crusaders endured conditions even worse than during the winter siege. They were trapped inside Antioch with limited food supplies, surrounded by an enemy army 5 times their size, and cut off from any hope of relief. Many knights talked openly of surrender or conversion to Islam. The psychological pressure was enormous. After nearly 3 years of campaigning, the survivors of the People's Crusade, the march across Anatolia, and the siege of Antioch were exhausted, outnumbered, and desperate. Some openly questioned whether God had abandoned them or whether they were being punished for their sins. It was at this moment of maximum despair that something extraordinary happened. Something that would become one of the most controversial episodes in the entire history of the Crusades. A French priest named Peter Bartholomew claimed to have received a vision from St. Andrew, who told him that the lance that had pierced Christ's side during the crucifixion was buried beneath the altar of St. Peter's Cathedral in Antioch. Whether this was a genuine mystical experience, a pious fraud designed to boost morale, or a deliberate hoax, has been debated by historians for centuries. What is certain is that the discovery of the Holy Lance had an electrifying effect on Crusader morale. On June 14, 1098, the Crusaders began digging beneath St. Peter's Cathedral. After hours of excavation, they unearthed an ancient iron lance head. News of the discovery spread through the starving army like wildfire. Men who had been ready to surrender were suddenly talking about divine victory. The skeptics, led by the papal legate Adhemar of Le Puy, questioned the authenticity of the relic. But the rank-and-file Crusaders were desperate for any sign that God had not abandoned them, and they embraced the Holy Lance as proof of divine intervention. On June 28, 1098, the Crusaders made a decision that seemed like collective self-destruction. They would march out of Antioch and fight Kerboga's massive army in open battle. 12,000 half-starved Crusaders against 75,000 fresh Muslim troops. The Crusaders marched out of Antioch in perfect formation, carrying the Holy Lance as their standard. They were convinced that God was fighting alongside them, that the relic would protect them from enemy arrows, and that victory was divinely guaranteed. Meanwhile, now do you remember I just explained how a wide variety of troops was under Kerboga coalition? Well, you see from the outside it looks exactly as I described, but as soon as you take a sneak peek, what you see is Kerboga's coalition was riddled with the same internal divisions that had plagued the Muslim world since Malik Shah's death. His army included troops from a dozen different rulers, who mistrusted each other almost as much as they hated the Crusaders. Many of his allies were more concerned with preserving their own forces than achieving collective victory. When Bohemond's heavy cavalry, organized into disciplined formations, smashed into the Muslim line, something unexpected happened. Instead of holding firm, Kerboga's coalition began to crumble. One by one, his allies decided they would rather retreat and fight another day than risk their armies in someone else's battle. What had started as an orderly withdrawal turned into a complete rout. By evening, Kerboga's massive army had disintegrated, and the Turkish commander was fleeing back to Mosul with the remnants of his forces. The Crusaders spent the next day looting the abandoned Muslim camp, collecting enough wealth to finance the rest of their campaign. The victory outside Antioch was the turning point of the First Crusade, but it also marked the beginning of the expedition's fragmentation. Bohemond immediately declared himself Prince of Antioch and made it clear he would not be continuing to Jerusalem with the main army. And on August 1st, 1098, just 5 weeks after the victory outside Antioch, Bishop Adhemar of Le Puy died of what was probably typhus. Adhemar's death was more than just the loss of a respected leader. It marked the end of direct papal control over the crusade. Adhemar had been Pope Urban's personal representative, the man responsible for ensuring that the expedition served the Church's interests rather than purely secular goals. With his death, the remaining crusade leaders were free to pursue their own agendas without ecclesiastical oversight. The consequences were immediate. Bohemond refused to honor his oath to return Antioch to the Byzantine Empire, arguing that Emperor Alexios had forfeited any claim to the city by abandoning the Crusaders during their hour of need. Raymond of Toulouse found himself increasingly isolated as other leaders chose personal advancement over collective goals. But the most serious consequence of Adhemar's death was the loss of unified command. The bishop had been the one person whom all the crusade leaders respected enough to accept his arbitration of disputes. Without him, the expedition began fragmenting into competing factions. In September 1098, the remaining leaders wrote to Pope Urban asking him to come to Antioch personally and take control of the expedition. But Urban declined, either because he was too old for such a journey or because he realized that his presence in the East would leave the papal reform movement vulnerable to imperial attack in the West. As the Crusader army finally resumed its march toward Jerusalem in January 1099, the moral degradation that had been building throughout the campaign reached its nadir at the Syrian city of Ma'ara. After capturing the town following a brief siege, the Crusaders found themselves desperately short of food in the middle of winter. What happened next shocked even contemporary chroniclers and became a propaganda tool for Muslim leaders seeking to unite resistance against the Crusaders. Some of the poorest Crusaders, known as Tafurs, reportedly turned to cannibalism, eating the flesh of dead Muslims. The Tafurs were the most radical element of the Crusader army, landless peasants, urban poor, and social outcasts who had survived the entire campaign through a combination of fanaticism and brutality. They claimed to be following a literal interpretation of Christ's command to take no thought for what they would eat or drink, trusting God to provide for their needs. Whether the cannibalism at Ma'ara was driven by starvation, religious fanaticism, or calculated psychological warfare, its effect on Muslim opinion was devastating. The incident convinced many Muslims that the Crusaders were not just political enemies, but inhuman monsters who posed an existential threat to Islamic civilization. By the time the Crusader army reached the Palestinian coast in the spring of 1099, the expedition had been reduced to about half its peak strength. Baldwin remained in Edessa, Bohemond stayed in Antioch, and many other nobles had carved out their own territories in northern Syria. The Crusade army keeps getting fractured, and each faction carving out their own land in the conquered Middle East. The army, which left when that finally approached Jerusalem in June 1099, numbered only about 13,000 men, 1,200 cavalry and 12,000 infantry. They represented perhaps 10% of the original force that had left Europe 3 years earlier. But this surviving corps had been hardened by years of warfare into one of the most effective military forces in the medieval world. They had learned to fight Turkish cavalry, conduct siege warfare, and survive in hostile territory. Most importantly, they had developed a siege mentality that viewed any non-Christian as a potential enemy. The march down the Palestinian coast was marked by a series of massacres that prefigured what would happen in Jerusalem. At every town that resisted, the Crusaders showed no mercy to civilian populations. The distinction between combatants and non-combatants, which had never been strong in medieval warfare, disappeared entirely. Interestingly, when the Crusader army reached the walls of Jerusalem on June 7, 1099, they faced a city that had already been conquered and overthrown twice in recent years. The Fatimid rulers of Egypt had reconquered Jerusalem from the Seljuk Turks in 1098, just as the Crusaders were fighting for Antioch. The Crusaders going to face the army now is Fatimid garrison commanded by Iftikhar al-Dawla, an experienced military officer who had about 1,000 soldiers and a civilian population swollen with refugees fleeing the Crusaders' advance through Palestine. The Fatimids offered the Crusaders a generous peace settlement. They could make pilgrimage to Jerusalem as holy sites and then leave in peace. But the Crusaders had not come 3,000 miles to be tourists. I don't think at this point even the Pope could have stopped them when the fanaticism was at its peak. They wanted permanent control of Jerusalem, and they were not interested in negotiating with what they considered an illegitimate Muslim occupation. The siege lasted 5 weeks, from June 7th to July 15th, 1099. Unlike Antioch, Jerusalem's walls were not impossibly strong, but the Crusaders faced a different problem: time. They had no supply base in Palestine and very little food or water. An Egyptian relief army was already marching north from Cairo. The breakthrough came on June 17th, when ships from Genoa arrived at the port of Jaffa with crucial supplies, including timber and skilled engineers. The Genoese captain Guglielmo Embriaco supervised the construction of siege engines, working frantically to complete them before the Egyptian army arrived. On July 8th, following the advice of a priest who claimed to have received a vision, the entire Crusader army marched barefoot around Jerusalem's walls in a solemn religious procession. They were imitating the biblical story of Joshua and the walls of Jericho, hoping for a similar miracle. Muslim defenders jeered from the battlements, but the Crusaders believed they were following divine instructions. The final assault began before dawn on July 15, 1099. The Crusaders concentrated their attack on the northern and southern walls, using their siege towers to get over the fortifications, while battering rams attacked the gates. At 3 o'clock in the afternoon, exactly the hour when Christians believed Jesus Christ had died on the cross, Godfrey of Bouillon's siege tower reached the northern wall. A knight named Ludolf of Tournai was the first crusader to leap onto Jerusalem's battlements, followed by dozens of others. Once the walls were breached, resistance collapsed quickly. The Muslim garrison retreated to the Temple Mount, hoping to make a final stand at the Al-Aqsa Mosque and the Dome of the Rock, Islam's third holiest site. What happened next in Jerusalem has been debated by historians for nearly 1,000 years, but there is no doubt that it was one of the worst massacres in medieval history. The Crusaders went on a killing spree that lasted 3 days and left the city's streets running with blood. The exact number of casualties is impossible to determine. Contemporary Muslim sources claim that 70,000 people were killed, while European chroniclers admit to about 10,000 deaths. Modern historians estimate that somewhere between 30 and 40,000 people died, including refugees who had fled to Jerusalem for protection. The scale of the violence was shocking even by medieval standards. The Crusaders killed not only Muslim soldiers, but also Muslim civilians, Jewish residents, and even some Eastern Christians whom they couldn't distinguish from Muslims. Age and gender provided no protection. Children and elderly were slaughtered alongside able-bodied adults. The main synagogue was burned with Jews sheltering inside. The Al-Aqsa Mosque became a slaughterhouse where, according to the Muslim chronicler Ibn al-Athir, crusaders waded in blood up to their ankles. Contemporary Christian chronicles describe piles of severed heads and hands stacked like pyramids in the city squares. When the killing finally stopped, Jerusalem had been ethnically cleansed of virtually its entire non-Christian population. The Crusaders immediately began converting mosques into churches and establishing a Latin Christian administration that would last for nearly a century. On July 22, 1099, the surviving Crusader leaders met to choose a ruler for their new conquest. After some debate about whether Jerusalem should be ruled by the church or by a secular monarch, they elected Godfrey of Bouillon as king. Godfrey refused the title of king, saying he would not wear a crown of gold where Christ had worn a crown of thorns, and instead took the title Defender of the Holy Sepulchre. 3 weeks later, the Crusaders faced their final test when an Egyptian army of about 20,000 troops arrived to retake Jerusalem. At the Battle of Ascalon on August 12, 1099, Godfrey led his small army in a surprise dawn attack that completely routed the much larger Muslim force. The victory secured Crusader control of Palestine and marked the effective end of the First Crusade. News of Jerusalem's capture spread across Europe like wildfire. Church bells rang from Ireland to Poland as Christians celebrated what they saw as the greatest victory in the history of Christendom. Pope Urban II had died on July 29th, just 2 weeks after Jerusalem fell, without ever learning whether his gamble had succeeded. But the Crusaders' triumph came at an enormous cost in human life and moral authority. Of the hundreds of thousands of Europeans who had taken the cross and marched east, fewer than 20,000 lived to see Jerusalem. The People's Crusade had been virtually wiped out. Disease, starvation, and battle had claimed the vast majority of those who began the journey. The human cost among Muslims, Jews, and Eastern Christians was even higher. Beyond the immediate casualties of siege and massacre, entire communities had been uprooted or destroyed. The Rhineland Jewish communities took generations to recover from the pogroms of 1096. Syrian and Palestinian cities lost much of their population to death, slavery, or flight. The political consequences were equally profound. The Crusaders had established 4 independent European colonies in the heart of the Muslim world: the Kingdom of Jerusalem under Godfrey, the Principality of Antioch under Bohemond, the County of Edessa under Baldwin, and the County of Tripoli, which would be established by Raymond's successors in 1102. These Crusader states represented something unprecedented in medieval history. European settler colonies thousands of miles from their homeland, surrounded by hostile populations and dependent on a constant stream of reinforcements from the West. They would survive for nearly 2 centuries, but they would never be secure. For the Byzantine Empire, the Crusade was a catastrophic miscalculation. Emperor Alexios had asked for a few thousand mercenaries to help him reclaim some territory in Turkey. Instead, he had gotten a massive invasion that carved up the Middle East without consulting him and left the Normans in control of Antioch, one of Byzantium's most important cities. For the Islamic world, the Crusader victory was a devastating shock that took generations to process and respond to. For over 400 years, Muslim armies had been expanding at Christian expense. The idea that European barbarians could march across 3 continents and capture Islam's 3rd holiest city was almost incomprehensible. But perhaps the most lasting consequence was ideological. The First Crusade had introduced a new concept into international relations: Holy war as foreign policy. The idea that religious differences justified total war, ethnic cleansing, and the conquest of distant lands would outlive the medieval period by centuries. Standing in the blood-soaked streets of Jerusalem in July 1099, watching European knights celebrate their victory by converting mosques into churches and erecting crosses on the ruins of synagogues, an observer might have wondered whether this was really what God wanted. But by then, it was far too late to ask such questions. The First Crusade had succeeded beyond its creator's wildest dreams, but it had also unleashed forces that no one could control. Pope Urban had wanted to unite Europe behind the Catholic Church and strengthen papal authority. Emperor Alexios had wanted military assistance against the Turks. Muslim leaders had wanted to maintain their control over the Middle East. None of them had achieved their original goals, but all had helped create something far more dangerous and long-lasting. The Crusaders had come east believing they were servants of God, but they had ended up serving primarily themselves. They had established European colonies in the Middle East that would require centuries of warfare to maintain. They had introduced the concept of religious genocide into international relations, and they had created a legacy of mutual hatred between Christianity and Islam that would influence politics and warfare for the next millennium. When Osama bin Laden called Americans crusaders in his propaganda videos, he wasn't reaching back 30 years to the Cold War or even 2 centuries to European colonialism. He was reaching back 900 years to 1099, when European Christians had conquered Jerusalem and massacred its Muslim inhabitants in the name of God. The First Crusade was many things: a military expedition, a religious pilgrimage, a colonial venture, and a genocidal campaign. But above all, it was a perfect storm of religious fanaticism, political ambition, and historical accident that reshaped the medieval world and created conflicts that echo to this day. 3 dying empires had gambled everything on a single throw of the dice, and the resulting explosion had changed the course of world history. The Crusaders had won their holy war, but in doing so, they had started a conflict that would never really end.